A year ago, we were just beginning to learn about the existence of the Occupy Wall Street movement, and I wrote a piece last week in the current issue of The Economist that looked at what had happened to that movement and I guess charted how it hasn't really flowered into a coherent movement, but it's changed the conversation fundamentally. And so we're now at a point where notions like the 1% and the 99% are a routine part of our discourse, and a presidential candidate can talk about 47% and probably lose himself the election in the process. And this is, it goes to the heart of the fact that really the whole wave, it seems to me, of this transactional capitalism that Adrian talked about, of which Mitt Romney is one of the pioneers, and the extraordinary innovations that have happened over the last 25 years have gone side by side and clearly played a part in a much widening income story and wealth story in this society, but also the spread of globalization has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty into the mainstream global economy. And so, Jagdish, I wanted to start with you. I mean, how worried or not should we be about these remarkable trends around inequality?
Yes and no. In the West, most definitely, we have seen movements like the Occupy movement, which actually attack the 1% versus 99%. Though I've always been puzzled by the fact that the people like us belong to the middle, and we've been doing rather well. So we're talking about the extremes, basically. And
when you say the middle, do you mean the top 5%, or do you mean...
No, between, say, 20% and going down to about 70%. The real issue, as far as in my judgment, which should have political salience and which will come back, is what to do about the bottom 30%, very much like in the developing countries. So I think this discourse about 1 versus 99 is going to disappear as soon as the elections are over with. The president has actually wound up focusing on that, but I think it's a misspecification of the distributional issue. So I think it's part of the discourse right now, but I don't see it as enduring. If you go to developing...
What about the 47%?
That was a big mistake on his part, but I think it's a standard
there's
gap.
This notion that half the population doesn't pay tax, and that.
But I think he was confusing two very different things. I think what he probably heard from people like you, which was that in the European discourse, we often say, like Asa Lindbeck and others, that to dismantle or reduce the welfare state is very difficult because there are so many people who are profiting from it. And I think that's essentially what he was trying to say, though he doesn't know how to say it, which was that really getting to do something about it, anything by way of raising revenue, etc., or dismantling or reducing the size of our spending. You really can't do it because there are too many people who are profiting from it. But I think he put it in a rather stupid way, in my judgment. So I think the 47% is one of the gaffes. You remember, everybody drops bricks, in fact, boulders, during the election. John Kerry, whom I admire, you remember, he almost sounded like Lou Dobbs when he accused corporations during the presidential campaign of being Benedict Arnolds. I don't know who the hell Benedict Arnold was. I thought he was some obscure English poet, a distant cousin of Matthew Arnold. And it turned out to be the biggest traitor of this country. And so I'm told that Bob Rubin, seeing this, he was one of the advisors to John Kerry, and he said, if you repeat it, I'm out of your campaign. And after that, he never did. But it's such a fast-moving thing that people will do these crazy things, and they sometimes suffer from it. And since I'm a Democrat, I'm not too upset about Romney, creating this gaffe.
So from your perspective, Adriana, do you agree that the 1%, 99% a false dichotomy?
I actually think it's a relevant figure to remember. I mean, let's go back to post-World War II and think about that period. During that time period, up until basically 79, everybody was growing together. The economy was growing, everybody was moving together, and all quintiles of the income distribution were moving together. Starting in the past 3 decades, we've been moving apart. We've had the top part of the income distribution, the top quintile, growing much faster than the middle part of the income distribution, and the lower quintile actually shrinking in terms of the income that they get. So we've been growing apart, and we've been growing apart for the past few decades. The 1990s was actually an exception. During the 1990s, we actually had a period, about an 8-year period, when people were growing together thanks to the policies that were put in place, thanks to the growth that we experienced during that time period. And let me remind you that according to the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, the top 1% has seen an increase in their income of about 300%, while the middle quintile of the distribution, the middle 20%, has seen an increase of 25%. So these numbers that the president has cited and the president's advisors have cited are coming from the Bipartisan Congressional Budget Office, and they're not new numbers. They've been there for some time. They're issues that are not going away. I think it's important to remember that the reason why this increase in dispersion and inequality is relevant is because if we move more people to the top, but especially if we move more people to the bottom, and we don't see people having the ability to move up, then we're really concerned. If we don't have enough mobility in a society for those people who are moving down to actually have prospects later in their life, or for their children to have prospects later in their life, we should be very concerned.
The argument that is often made by those that want to defend the current income spectrum, or certainly defend the top 1% or so, is that, I mean, they are fundamentally, wealth creators who have basically produced extraordinary innovations and helped drive the dynamism of the economy. And the issues relating to why they've succeeded and moved ahead at the top are fundamentally different from the set of issues that have marooned the average American household with sort of no real increase in income for 25 years or whatever. That we're artificially conflating two very different sort of economic stories. And I mean, to what extent do you think that's true? And it's better to really just focus on what we do about the average household than to get too hung up on what's happening to the 1%.
I think we need to be concerned about both. We need to be concerned, obviously, mainly about those in the lower end of the distribution and how to offer opportunities for people to move up. But I think certainly the progressivity or decrease in the progressivity of the tax system has some to do with that. And if we go back in time to the 1950s, the marginal tax rates, the top marginal tax rate was at 90%. If we go back to the 80s, it was at 70%. We're now at 28%. During the 90s, the top tax rate was at 39%. So we're not talking even about increasing it back to the levels that we had back in the 1950s or even to the 1980s. We're talking about making the tax system a little bit more progressive so that we can all benefit. Why? Because it is true, you need job creators, but you also need consumers, and you need to have enough demand for those job creators to actually create jobs and to see that there is demand for their products, for their services out there. We actually know that the payroll tax cuts that we've seen passed through this administration and the extension of unemployment benefits have been very crucial at generating demand. We know that per every $1, for example, that we put into the pockets of an unemployed person, $2 ripple through the economy. CBO has done estimates that per every $1 that we put due to payroll tax cuts, per every $1 that we put into the hands of middle-class workers, between $1.1 and $1.9 ripple through the economy. So that money is also really key. You need the demand out there. Sure, you need the job creators. Nobody would argue otherwise. You need big businesses and small businesses to create jobs, but you definitely need that demand, and that's very key.
So the critique of raising taxes for the wealth-creating class, that it's usually that if you raise the marginal rate of tax on additional wealth, that you will discourage wealth creation. Do you think there's any validity to that model? I mean, Jagdish?
But it has. I think the part of the reason why people are paying less taxes than they used to before is the capital gains taxation, basically, because that's much lower. And then the theory there is that that is what leads to wealth creation. And that's the one you would have to attack. It's not that people are being exempted. You look at Romney's taxes, they're low during the period when he's actually earning capital gains. So I think that's an issue which we want to address.
If you were to raise the capital gains tax rate from, say, 15% to 30%.
Yes, and then you've got to answer the
really
question. But then, Matthew, you've got to answer the question. Will that, the theory behind keeping it low is that, in fact, it leads to wealth creation. But from the Democratic side, many of us feel that in fact leads to lower tax burden and very little effect on wealth creation. So that's where the debate would actually go. And it's hard to make up one's mind on that. But certainly that's the answer. That's the relevant question.
But is it your guess that if you were to double the marginal rate of tax, it would have much impact or not on capital gains and wealth creation?
I think what would happen is that people are mobile. And this is a problem which Hollande is running into also. Like, what is it? He's got now 75%. Hollande in Paris.
Oh, yes.
I mean, he wants to raise the taxation to 75% at the margin. Immediately, he's got to worry about, will people then migrate to Germany? And Europe there's a fair amount of mobility. So that's another angle we have to look at. Namely, will people disappear? And this guy who disappeared to Singapore, I mean, certainly he was responding to some extent to the tax rate. So I think it's a delicate balance to be struck here, in my opinion. It's very difficult to come up with a very firm point of view here. And I think your ideological predilections are going to make a difference to where you come out. The president is certainly coming out on the side of raising taxes, raising capital gains tax in effect, and Romney is really coming out the other way. If I had to take a guess, I would probably vote with the president on this one.
Now, the critique that we hear most about the Obama administration is that it's really failed to get to grips with the labor market challenges that America faces, that we still have unemployment at over the 8% threshold at which no sitting president has been re-elected since FDR, and that number greatly understates the genuine level of unemployment and underemployment in the economy, that many people have withdrawn from the labor market, that many people are doing jobs that don't in any sense produce the fulfillment that they would like, or the amount of income or time to work that they would like. And to what extent do you feel the administration is actually getting to grips with those issues, and to what extent are these problems easily addressed in terms of a short period of time, or are there longer term issues that you've seen that really America needs to face up to?
Yeah, so let me first start by reminding you where we came from, right? In December 2007, the US entered into the deepest recession since the Great Depression, if not bigger, because we didn't have the housing market crisis that we had this time around back during the Great Depression. So basically, GDP growth was contracting at a rate of 8% in the last quarter of 2008. 800,000 jobs were being lost in a single month when the president came into office. We were bleeding jobs, and good over 4 million jobs had already been lost even before the president took office. When the president took office and the Recovery Act got passed in February 2009, you started seeing a complete turnaround. So we were coming here, we were on a free fall, basically. We started seeing a recovery quickly after the Recovery Act got passed, actually. So if you look at jobs numbers, we stopped bleeding jobs, and eventually, less than a year later, by a year later, in February 2010, we were already creating jobs. and 4.6 million jobs have been created in the past 30 months. We have had 12 consecutive quarters of GDP growth, and there has been a steady recovery with ebbs and webs, ups and downs, sure.
But
nonetheless, it has stayed there. The unemployment rate has fallen by close to 2 percentage points. It has fallen across the board, across the country, across the regions.
It's higher than it was when the president took office.
It has, sorry?
It's a higher unemployment rate than when the president took office.
Yeah, technically, if you look at it, February 2009, the unemployment rate was at 8.3%. So lower than in February. If you expect an immediate impact as soon as the president takes office in January, it was slightly lower.
But it's
8.1%. Now, let me remind you that this recovery has been very different from previous recoveries in that we haven't had the job creation in the government sector that we have had in every single recovery in the 1970s, in the 1980s, in the 1990s, and then in the 2001 recovery. So we haven't had the benefit of having jobs created in the government sector. If you take account of that, the unemployment rate would be a lot lower, certainly. And if you just looked at private sector job creation, then the unemployment rate would be much lower. Let me get at the other issue that you raised about how we measure unemployment and who we count as the unemployed. In fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics gives us counts in various ways. The more standard way, which has been measured for the past 70 years, is the one that everybody knows, 8.1%. And it's the same measure that gets used by almost every single country around the globe. But the BLS also measures some of these other workers that you mentioned. Some that may be marginally attached to the labor force, some that are so-called part-timers for economic reasons that would prefer to be full-time but are part-time workers. No matter which way you measure the unemployment rate, it has been falling, meaning that all those groups of workers, not only the standard measure as unemployed, people who are looking for work and available for work, but also those marginally attached and the part-timers for economic reasons have been falling in the past 2 years.
So give me a vision for the next 4 years if the president were to get back in. Would you, one read on what you were saying would be, much bigger government would be a good way to address the unemployment problem. But more fundamentally, is the current pace of job creation, would not get us anywhere close to where we were in the end of the 1990s, early part of the new century in terms of that definition of full employment. So what's your vision as to how you could particularly address the challenges of job creation, particularly for younger people who I think probably are going to be a disproportionate group, both here and around the developed world, of those who are struggling to make their way in the labor market?
So let me remind you that at the beginning of the year, actually, we were creating 250,000 jobs per month. On average, over this year, it has been 160,000. As I said, there are ebbs and webs, but we have been there. We have been at the level we've been creating 250,000 jobs. Of course, you have headwinds from Europe, you have headwinds due to increases in oil prices, other things that come our way that are beyond our control. But I can tell you that back in September 2011, the president put out the American Jobs Act proposal. This American Jobs Act proposal had many parts to it. And again, it gets at different issues. One is making sure that we put more money into the pockets of the middle class so that we are sure that there is increased demand for goods and services, and so that employers are actually, who are on the verge of hiring or not hiring, actually take the next step. The second one is giving tax credits to businesses. And in fact, the president had put in the American Jobs Act and has continued to put forward a 10% tax cut for small businesses, who we know create about 2/3 of all jobs, right, of gross job creation. So that's another part of it. There are other parts that have to do with what are called pathways back to work. Pathways back to work would give people the opportunity to put their foot in the door, to get their foot in the door through on-the-job training, through registered apprenticeships, to be able to get out there. Another proposal that has been put by the president is the Community College to Career Fund, an $8 billion fund which would generate partnerships between community colleges and employers, again, to reduce the so-called skills gap and to be able to help training institutions provide the right skills for those jobs that are in demand out there. So that's another proposal. Very importantly, the infrastructural proposal, which has received bipartisan support for a long time, would create jobs in construction, a sector that was very hard hit. That would be good in the long run for the US. It would create the right infrastructure, improve our level and quality of infrastructure around the country, which also attracts businesses and benefits businesses, but in the short run also creates jobs in the construction sector.
Okay, I'm going to, in a second, go to questions, so please reconnect with that energy you had when you spoke to your neighbors earlier and come up with some good questions. Jagdish, before we do that, we didn't talk about the developing world. As you look at the big global story that we've had of hundreds of millions of people coming into the global labor market and how that changes the opportunity for the developing world, but also the competitive dynamics in the rich world, what are the 2 or 3 big predictions that you would make for the next few years, and what's going to happen?
We got a fair amount of demand coming from India, China, and Brazil, which has sustained our recovery to some extent. That, I suspect, will slow down in the short run for different reasons. Certainly, China, for instance, is running into immediate problems because they had an elastic supply of labor, the Marxist reserve army of labor. This demand was increasing in the Guangdong provinces. When you have an elastic supply of labor, you get very rapid growth. But when supply of labor begins to be expensive, labor becomes a binding constraint. And then China is rejoining the human race, and it's going to go down no matter what it does on the political side. On the political side, there are also problems because they're also beginning to see demand for more civil society, demand for political rights. Nobody knows which way it's going to work out. So I expect China is not going to be, either in the short run or in the long run, going to be playing the kind of role it has been doing. India has problems of living with its neighborhood. China creates its bad neighborhood. India largely has a bad neighborhood around itself. That is creating massive problems for India, along with the sort of scams and the political corruption, which it will have to handle. So I think these 2 countries, for different reasons, are going to be slowing down. So you're not going to get much from them. As far as Brazil is concerned, Brazil also is kind of slow, not going to do very well, because Brazil is protectionist. And if you have protectionism, I've been there in Rio recently, and it's like the pre-1991 reforms in India. Nothing really works. And in fact, the best competitive strategy on the part of America should be to let them be protectionist, because they'll never become efficient under protectionism. And then we'll have an easy time competing with them. So I think the general issue there is that the rest of the world, it's called the rest sometimes, as you know, is not going to be the great big prop that we have. And so given that...
Is it going to be less of a competitive threat as well?
I think it's going to be less of a competitive threat, certainly. But a lot will depend on how we do it. And that's where we haven't really discussed anything beyond all these figures and so on. But I think, to me, the really important thing is how the United States is going to be really looking at productivity increases, because that's what really determines your competitiveness. We didn't mention the retail sector, for example, which is another big thing in India and so on. If you look at Dale Jorgensen's figures on productivity increases, it's the retail sector which has really been the big thing. And the president is completely wrong in emphasizing manufacturers all the time, because manufacturers is not where you've had the biggest productivity increase. It has been retail. And why? It's because the retail sector has implemented the IT technology much more than any other sector. Now, so what we want to look forward to in looking at even manufacturers in this country is what is going to happen in manufacturers. Now, we have had the bailout, okay? We can discuss whether it was worth doing it or not. But in manufacturers, the bailout has succeeded so far, but I don't know whether it's going to succeed in the long run in competing with Toyota, etc. Because those of you, many of you will remember what happened with the first bailout, which Chrysler had. This is the second time. So sometimes it's called the Chapter 22 firm, okay, because it's dipped twice. Iacocca went on television, exactly like the current guy, saying that my cars are going to be already as good as the as the Japanese cars. At which point I'd reacted by saying, Iacocca is now making a new car salesman sound like a used car salesman. And within 2 years, he was not competitive. Today, we have used basically Toyota's technology, as doubtless you know, and made a little improvement. But Toyota is also doing it, and it's going to be spread all over. Are we going to be competitive in 3 years from now? And if we are putting all our eggs into the manufacturing basket, we better beware. But it is these issues which make me worried about the US and the presidential leadership right now.
Okay, so let's very quickly take 2 or 3 comments and questions from the audience. Lady right at the front here. If you'd say who you are, if there's an organization you're with, but please keep your remarks really short because we're very short on time. Here's the microphone. And after you, who else have we got raising a hand? Gentleman over there. Okay, we'll just take those 2, please.
I'm Carol Hardy. I'm just here independently. And you're talking about job statistics. And I think that many economists use tools from the past to measure the present and predict the future. While things are going on, people on the ground are getting on with their lives. And a lot of little people are starting little businesses on the internet. And I don't think these are measurable because they don't pay taxes, they're not counted.
So what's the question?
How would you be able to understand the job statistics if all these little underground jobs are rising up and some of them will become real jobs?
So are we missing a bigger story that's going on? Okay, over here. Thank you.
Yes, my name's Tom Cadell. I'm with the press. I'm a blogger and a reporter. Sorry, I've got my thing here.
Quick question, please.
I'm sorry. There's a movement called reshoring, which you probably have heard, and which really emphasizes U.S. companies leaving China and coming back to the U.S. And there's that thought that perhaps these are going to turn into jobs. But I think that's misinformed because
can you make it a question, please?
Yes, because of robotics. And we know Foxconn, for example, will be putting 1 million robots and what have you. So I'm interested how the Obama administration's thinking along those lines because they're delivering a false message when in fact something else is different.
Great. I'm sorry that this had to be so brutal on interrupting, but
so can I answer
let's ask
to
those
the
2 questions. So are robots going to wipe out the reshoring, wipe out lots of jobs, and are we missing?
Yeah, let me answer your question first. So there are two sets of data that we produce every month. One comes from the household survey, one comes from the employer survey. You're right that the employer survey would mean mismatch of what you're mentioning because we keep surveying the same firms year after year, and we only take account of entry and exit every year. So there is an adjustment that gets done for that. In fact, it's coming out today. The preliminary benchmarking exercise is called, and that would try to take account of that. The household survey would do a much better job at capturing self-employment and capturing those small businesses that are entering, and we would be able to, and that's one of the reasons why the 2 measures are never exactly the same. So we do capture that, but it's captured much better in the household survey than it is in the other survey. With regards to your question on onshoring or reshoring and the importance of bringing those jobs back, we have been seeing a trend, actually, in terms of onshoring. There is, in fact, a committee that was created, Select USA, out of Department of Commerce, but it's an interagency. I participate in that group. And it's an effort to make sure that we explain both to domestic investors as well as to foreign firms what the benefits of bringing jobs back to the U.S. are. And of course, as you know, there are many factors that get considered when a firm is deciding to go abroad or not. One is closeness to markets, but there's also the issue of trying to save on labor costs and other sort of costs. Certainly, we have seen that. Make It in America is a grant initiative that was just introduced basically yesterday, in the past few days, by Department of Labor and Department of Commerce, trying to help communities and employers to bring back jobs.
Okay, but I guess the question, and this will be your closing comment, Jagdish. Make It in America, is it going to be largely the robots that are making it, and we're not going to have anything for the humans to do? Is that the next big shock to the labor market?
It could be, but I think you put your finger on the real issue, in my opinion, qualitatively, which is that there are two narratives about what's happening to the unskilled workers and how do we sort of help them. One is that it's a lot of technological change of the kind you're describing, with 5 people up there in a glass cage and there's nobody on the assembly line any longer. And so we are economizing continuously on the use of unskilled labor. And so there's pressure on their wages. And many of us believe on the international trade side that, in fact, these people are consuming products from outside, cheap lingerie, flip-flops, and so on and so forth, and they're actually benefiting from international trade. Real wages are being held up over what they would be otherwise. And the other is this, what the president seems to be buying into, and his advisors, that it's really international trade that is causing the depression of the wages. This is a real problem, and my worry is that by buying into what I consider to be a false narrative, the president's advisors may be selling him something which is actually going to hurt the workers and also the United States, because in the absence of international trade, you're going to lose the gains from trade as well. So it's both bad for the United States and it's going to be bad for the world. And that's the real choice in qualitative terms.
Well, on that note, The Economist was a newspaper founded to promote free trade, and so I think we probably know where we would come down on that particular issue, and I think it is something that
keep the pressure up.
We editorially are very concerned about the lack of progress on free trade around the world over the last few years. But I would like to again thank both Jagdish and Adriana for sharing with us this morning, and for getting the day off to a very stimulating beginning. So thank you very much. Thank you.